Supervisors, take your seats, please. Is my mic on? Can you hear me? All right. We can't find a flag. I happen to be wearing one, so please stand and do the pledge for me. Thank you. Pledge allegiance to the flag, the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And now I'm going to call on Clara Tappa to start the presentation. Kenosha County Employee Racial Equity Audit Assessment Report.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, supervisors. It should be on your table, or, oh, I'm sorry, they moved your name tag. There we go. All supervisors should have a report on your table. If you do not, please let us know. This summer, we launched the Kenosha County Employee Racial Equity Audit Assessment. The invitation to participate was sent out to all employees, and they had a couple of weeks to respond. This was a voluntary survey. As you will note when we get into the results, the response was quite good. Our goal this evening is to share those results with you and help you understand how to interpret the report. This assessment establishes a baseline for determining our racial equity competencies toward reaching our racial equity commitment. The goal will be to repeat this survey in the future to measure our progress. Our hope is that when we're finished with the presentation, we can allow some time for questions and answers at the end. This evening, I am very pleased to introduce to all of you Bird Guess and Renee Paulson of the Racial Equity Group, who conducted the assessment. You can see them up on the screen there. A little bit about our presenters. Bird Guess is President and CEO of Racial Equity Group and has over a decade of management consulting experience. His areas of expertise include conducting racial equity audit assessments, advising executives on diversity and inclusion strategies, designing and delivering racial equity training curriculum, integrating equity into organizational policies and practices, and ultimately making racial equity standard operating procedure. He is a published author of 4 books and working on his 5th and upcoming book, Bigger Than Racism. Dr. Renee Paulson is president and senior statistician of Elite Research, and her firm has a strategic partnership with Racial Equity Group to support and manage the data assessment and validity for the Racial Equity Group's audit assessments, focus groups, and surveys. She has worked on a number of assessment projects, particularly around attitude and behavioral change toward minority groups and women in STEM, and is well published in the field. With that, I will turn it over to Bird, who will present the report.
Great, thank you so much, Clara. Just want to do a quick audio check. Clara, are you able to hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. And I want to say good evening to all of the supervisors and all of the stakeholders for the Kenosha County. It is an honor to be able to share this report with you and these results. And we're just excited to be able to partner with you all as you all continue to focus on advancing racial equity for everyone within Kenosha County, all residents and all stakeholders. And I'll also pass it to Renee for some introductory remarks as well. Renee.
Yes, thank you, everyone. We're very excited to be able to kick off this baseline report and help you really understand what this data says and means and kind of using it as a guide on where to direct forward. Thank you.
All right. So we're going to go ahead and proceed now through our slides, and we're going to go to what we call our audit assessment report roadmap. This will serve as a table of contents for us through this presentation. So as you see here, we have multiple sections. I want you to focus just on the highlighted section that says introduction. So in our first section, we will focus on a little bit of background information on what is our framework, what is our approach when conducting this audit assessment. What does racial equity really mean for Kenosha County? Then once we go through our introduction, we're going to proceed to our next phase, which will be our executive summary. This is where we're going to look into some key findings. We want to get a snapshot of who responded from Kenosha County, who were the participants, what were some of the demographics that we were able to capture with this data. From the executive summary, we will proceed to the road to commitment. And this is where we're going to provide some actions, immediate actions that the county can begin to take towards advancing racial equity. The next phase is a more of a narrative format where we as the consultants provide our recommendations and next steps in a narrative format that cover really insights, ideas, and observations from the data that we were able to extract. And then finally, in the appendix, we have the detailed data. For those of you that really want to get into the details about the methodology, if you want to look at the more granular aspects of the audit assessment as far as individual items, racial demographics, and a lot of other areas, that's what the appendix, we will provide an overview for that as well. So this is kind of be our map and our guide for the presentation this evening. Proceeding to the introduction. So as we presented and collected data for the county's inaugural racial equity audit assessment in June of 2021, we realized that this was the beginning of this journey for the county. And so we have to really understand, what does racial equity look like for Kenosha County? And I won't read all of this to you word for word. I'll just kind of summarize it. But that journey, I'll kind of highlight it with my laser pointer. That journey is about ensuring that everyone has equal opportunity to live, work, play, and raise a family in Kenosha County. And then I'll proceed down to this middle paragraph. This is very important because this paragraph, or this definition of racial equity for Kenosha County was presented to all of the employees through the invite, for them to have this in their mind as they're answering questions and statements related to the audit assessment. And so to summarize this, what is racial equity for Kenosha County? It's really about ensuring that everyone has equal opportunity to be employed with Kenosha County. It's having access to career development and professional and promotional opportunities. It's also about having equal opportunity to become a vendor or a contractor with Kenosha County, and ultimately receiving fair treatment and quality in all of the services that are provided by Kenosha County. So when you really think about racial equity, it's very comprehensive. It looks at how we employ people, how we promote people, train and develop people. It looks at how all of our service delivery and our operations. It looks at who we spend our resources with as far as procurement and contracting, and then also even how we engage our stakeholders. Who do we engage as far as boards and commissions, and who's not represented from the county as well. So look at racial equity as a comprehensive approach for equal opportunity for all residents and stakeholders in the county. Now, the audit assessment measures the most important competencies and actions for producing and sustaining racial equity within the county. And I'll move into exactly what are those competencies? What are those 6 competencies, and how do we identify them? And also making you aware that these are the evidence-based best practices on these competencies from our decades of research on how municipalities and how companies and organizations have advanced and ensured equal opportunity within their organizations. The racial equity continuum overview. So it really, in order to establish a benchmark for racial equity, we as a consultant firm, we look at our evidence-based best practices, and we look at our competencies. There's 6 competencies that, again, that I'm going to define for you here in a moment. But within these 6 competencies, once we are able to get feedback from all of the employees from the county who are invited on this, we can come up with a more valid, measurable benchmark and identify where does the county fall on this racial equity continuum. This continuum is really measuring how committed are we as a county to advancing racial equity and equal opportunity for all of our stakeholders. So this continuum, as you see, it ranges on a scale of 1 to 5. and it moves from an area on the continuum that shows that these are institutions or organizations that are displaying actions that impede racial equity versus organizations that are committed and demonstrating actions that advance racial equity. And you can also see some general descriptions, more summary descriptions for different types of institutions based on where they fall on this continuum scale. And I'll highlight just a few of these, but keep in mind in the appendix, there are more detailed definitions for each one of these types of institutions. Let me give you an example. Let's start right here with what's called a colorblind institution. A colorblind institution is any type of organization that says, you know what? We don't look at any type of race or ethnicity. We don't want any data on it. Everyone here is treated fairly and equally. So we don't want to look at anything. We just want to just do our normal business operations. However, we have to take into effect that we know as a history, as a nation and so many counties and organizations all across our country, we have a history of being a racialized society and a gendered society that has created inequities for race and gender through historical policies and practices. And so what we don't realize is that if we don't want to look at any type of data, then we may have blind spots. And what's what we call them, even though they're colorblind, they actually can be blind spots because we can see some groups that are actually achieving or advancing more than other groups. And it could be race, it could be gender. And race and gender are two of the most persistent and pervasive inequities in our society. Of course, there's inequities in all different other types of social groups, but racial equity has been the most persistent and the most pervasive inequity within our society, followed by gender as well, even though gender has made some progress over the last several decades. What's a cautious institution? Going from colorblind to cautious are organizations or institutions that are a little hesitant to initiate policies and practices that are focused on race and ethnicity. They want to keep it broad. They want to say, we don't want to really focus on race. We want it to be diversity and inclusion, make it more broad. They believe race matters, but they just want to get it right and kind of satisfy everyone instead of focused on what are the largest gaps and the largest disparities. And many times they're often race and ethnicity. What's a compliant institution? These are organizations that we see that only begin to implement diversity, equity, inclusion, or racial equity when there's been a complaint to the Human Resources Department, or there's potential litigation from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So in other words, these organizations now are saying, you know what, we want to protect ourselves from potential litigation. So we will do some bias training or diversity training to show that we've kind of checked the box on that to protect ourselves from a compliance perspective. But the key is to really go from compliant to committed. Committed organizations are not reactionary like compliant institutions. They're proactive. They recognize that, you know what, race and ethnicity does matter in our society. We can't ignore that. Race and ethnicity does matter because we can look at any type of socioeconomic indicator, whether it's housing, education, income, health, wealth, and you will always see disparities, large disparities between race and ethnicity. So these organizations recognize that race does matter, and they prepare and equip all of their employees, all of their stakeholders to be able to communicate with each other, understand cultural competence, understand how to ensure to treat everyone fair, not just through individual interactions, but through policies and practices more than anything. And oftentimes there's policies and practices that can be unintentionally, let me say that again, many times there are policies and practices that unintentionally allow structural advantages in race and ethnicity to persist. And so ultimately, to summarize this, we wanted to figure out, where does Kenosha County fall on this racial equity commitment scale? Before I get into where the county falls and what our score is, I wanted to share with you what are the core competencies and what are the definitions of the core competencies that we assess the county on. In other words, out of the employees that we invited from Kenosha County to take this audit assessment, we asked them a series of questions that are related and tied to these 6 core competencies. Let me share with you the first one. The first one is what's called institutional commitment. And what we're looking for in this core competence is, does the county have dedicated talent and resources and accountability structures in place to ensure they can execute in advancing racial equity? In other words, are there things like a diversity, equity, inclusion officer? Are there accountability structures from management and leadership? Are we tying it to performance and goals? So those are the things that we're looking for as well. Have we made a commitment, whether it's a formal commitment that we want to advance racial equity for all of our stakeholders? So those are some of the items we're looking for in institutional commitment. But beyond that, we want to look at leadership commitment. We don't want the racial equity or diversity inclusion just to be the human resources job. When you think about equity, that should be everyone's job. All across all departments, managers, supervisors, everyone, we want to develop this racial equity mindset. In other words, we want everyone to have a mindset to ensure that there's equal opportunity regardless of your race or ethnicity. So we want to measure how committed are our managers and supervisors and leaders at the department or functional level. Have they taken ownership on racial equity? Have they established goals? Have they set expectations? Do they lead by example? Do they evaluate their policies and their practices to advance racial equity? Our third competency is what's called capacity building. This measures how effective an organization is in building relationships with our external stakeholders, community organizations, nonprofit organizations. As large as the county is, the county by itself cannot advance racial equity within the county without having community input, soliciting that input prior to decision making, prior to allocating resources, and getting input from racially diverse stakeholders within the community. So we want to measure that as well. The fourth competency is data and disparities. This measures, are we collecting the data, monitoring the data, tracking data by race and ethnicity? It's really hard to advance racial equity if we're not collecting data to be able to recognize and get insights from race and ethnicity in all aspects of our operations as a county and as an institution. So we want to look at, what are the data gaps? What data are we not collecting that would allow us to make insights and make us and better informed decisions about ensuring equal opportunity? Belonging and inclusion. This just measures, do all of our employees, regardless of race and ethnicity, how engaged are they? We may have some blind spots. Many times organizations will measure belonging and inclusion, and they will look at it at what's called the aggregate level, meaning they'll dump all the employees into one data set, and then they'll look at the aggregate level and they'll say, you know what? The majority of our employees feel like they belong, they feel included, they feel engaged. However, that could be a blind spot depending on the composition of your institution or your organization. One example is, if an organization is largely made up of white men or white women, and part of the organization is minority, has a small group of minorities, if you were to look at that aggregate data, the results would be skewed because most of the dominant group would say they feel like they belong and they feel like they're included, but your minority groups may not feel the same way. So it's very important to disaggregate data and understand, how do my white employees feel? How do our Black employees feel? How do our Hispanic employees feel? Asian, Native American, and on and on and on. It's really important to understand that as well, and that's what Belonging and Inclusion Insight will give us. And then finally, the last competency is knowledge and competence. What this really helps us understand is, do our employees really understand why we as a county should even be focused on racial equity? Do they understand how it should be tied to our mission, our purpose, and our vision as a county to serve all of our stakeholders equitably? Do they understand what biases are? And do they understand that just because of your bias doesn't mean you're racist, but your bias means you're human. But there are racial biases because we lived in a racialized society, as well as there are gender biases. So it's really important on understanding and making sure that we can create training. This is a great tool for human resources, because instead of just delivering general off-the-shelf diversity, equity, inclusion training, now we can make targeted efforts on where do our employees lack training. Do they understand what microaggressions are, racial biases, the different types of racial biases? Do they understand how biases impact performance evaluations, decision making? This will allow us to be able to get the insights so that human resources, Clara and her team, can make more targeted and more accurate training decisions, and also ensure a better return on investment for the county's resources as well. Now, we measured these core competencies using a 5-point Likert scale, which ranged from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And this is our assessment rating scale. So we asked employees a series of questions related to these competencies with this 5-point Likert scale. And so now we're going to transition into the executive summary, and let's look at some of the key findings from the county. And with this, I'm going to transition it over to my counterpart, Renee from Elite Research, who will walk us through these next few slides.
Thanks, Bert. So I'm hearing a little bit of echo. Is everyone okay on my side?
Yep, I can hear you just fine. I'll mute myself just to be sure.
Okay, great. So we did about approximately 3 weeks collection period. Kenosha County invited nearly 1,200 employees to participate. We look at a few different response rate categorizations when we look at, did we achieve sort of some minimum acceptable numbers in assessment work? So we know that approximately, or just under 40% of the employees reacted and engaged with the email invitation. Of those 467 who reacted to the email invitation, 79% of them started the assessment survey, which is a great response rate relative to those who engage with the email. And then we look at several criteria to determine valid response rates. If you've taken surveys before, sometimes you sort of pay attention to the questions, and sometimes we go too fast, kind of patterning in the data, or sometimes too slow, we're leaving the computer and letting it sit, and various other predetermined validity factors that we check. And so Kenosha County had nearly 79% valid responses, which is excellent in an online assessment tool. When we look at the demographic makeup, we're examining all of our analysis from here forward using those valid responses, the 304 valid responses that we received. And when we look at this makeup, we can kind of get a sense of, what those individuals look like. 58.2% were female, 76% reported being straight or heterosexual, 67.1% reported white, 7.2% Hispanic, 6.9% Black. And we can see that our age groups, we had predominantly almost 45% or so who were in those middle age groups of 35 to 54. Okay. Bert, if you go next slide. This slide tells us a little bit about the employee characteristics regarding their job description, their primary department. These again are not the response rates by department or job description, but rather the percentage of the 304 who made up these groups. You can see higher groups, administrative support staff at 13.5%, healthcare, law enforcement, managers and supervisors were all above 10% of the sample. In the primary departments, we can see 16.1% reported being from the Sheriff's Department, 9.2% from the Health, and 8.6% from Brookside Willowbrook. Okay. The majority of the respondents worked between 1 and 5 years for Kenosha County, followed by 6 to 10 years. And 71% reported not currently being a manager, So approximately 25% were manager. And then we examined or split the data to look at the manager and staff by race and gender. And so we can see for the respondents that for both groups, managers and staff, we had a large response rate by white women, 55.6% of managers. And then in the staff group, 46.8%. In white men, we also had a high group for the staff, 40.3%. And then for women of color, 17.8% of the managers reported being women of color and 6.5% of staff. You can see for every variable on this slide, as well as the demographics, we have an unknown or prefer not to say category. This is very common in assessments, individuals who may not want to report which department they're in or their race or their staff. These are still valid participants. We've done a validity check on their answers, but we leave them in as a response group, recognizing to see, how many of the sample prefer not to say these characteristics. Okay. Thanks, Bert.
Great. Thank you, Renee. Okay. And so now we want to look at those respondents, those employee respondents from the county. And when we look at how they assess the county on those 6 core competencies that we defined a few slides earlier, we can begin to understand what is the county's level of racial equity commitment based on those core competencies. So there were 34 statements that I will show you here momentarily. And based on those 34 statements allows us to get insight to how the county was assessed. And so ultimately, when we think about the continuum now, the county, based on the audit assessment report at the aggregate level, got a score of 3.66 for year 1. Y1 is the year 1. This will be our baseline year. Now, keep in mind, this is the aggregate score. And we also want to be able to look at the disaggregate as well, which we will talk about that. So this is the overall aggregate score for the county's level of racial equity commitment on the commitment continuum scale. Just to give you another view of this, another illustration of this, we can now look at, okay, what are the aggregate results on racial equity commitment? And let's begin to look at it by the 6 different core competencies and see how we scored in those areas. When it came to statements, they were on institutional commitment, leadership commitment, capacity building, data and disparities, belonging and inclusion, knowledge and competence. We can see the aggregate scores for each one of those core competencies and how well we performed as a county and were assessed on those. And this allows us also to understand where our priorities lie for advancing racial equity. As you can see, 2 of our lowest aggregate scores were capacity building. Remember, that's about community engagement, external stakeholder relationships, as well as data, looking at collecting data by race and ethnicity, analyzing data by race and ethnicity, and using data, race and ethnicity to be able to better inform decision making. So those were 2 of our lowest scores. Some of our stronger scores were belonging and inclusion, as well as knowledge and competence. And again, this kind of allows us, based on our scoring model, allows us to understand what are our highest priorities, what are our more moderate priorities, and what are some of our lower priorities based on how well we were assessed in these areas. Again, from that sample respondent group of employees who gave us their responses. How strong is racial equity commitment in each competency? So at the top of your screen, you're seeing the 6 core competencies that we've been talking about here momentarily. We've defined these 6 core competencies, but remember I told you that these 6 core competencies were tied to 34 statements or questions that employees were asked if they strongly disagree up to strongly agree using that 5-point Likert scale. And one of the first things you're going to notice is that a lot of these statements are boxed with different color codes. Let me take you down here to our legend and explain this for you. So you have different color coding for each of these statements. You have low commitment, moderate commitment, and high commitment. When you see statements that are highlighted in the darker blue, this means that employee respondents assessed us less than a 3 on that particular statement. The moderate commitment, or the lighter blue, means that employee respondents assessed us between a 3 and a 3.74 on that 5-point Likert scale. The high commitment are the respondents from the employees that assessed us greater than or equal to a 3.75. And so as you can see, just by looking at this, some of our lower commitment scores were in data and disparities, as well as in institutional commitment for our low commitment. And then we can also see some for our moderate commitment. And we can see belonging and inclusion were some of our more higher commitment scores in those areas. And then the numbers for each one of these statements, you can kind of see the scores for each, the aggregate scores for each individual statement here as well. That's tilted here to on the left side of the statement as well. Now, again, remember, this is the aggregate scores. And remember, I told you it's very important to understand the disaggregate, meaning being able to look at things with race and ethnicity and race consensus. So now we're going to transition to our next slide. And so now you notice we've added another color theme here to these same statements. So nothing else has changed, the 6 core competencies, and now the same 34 statements, but now we want to understand what is the race and ethnicity consensus for each of these competencies. In other words, I want to know, how did the county's white employees assess us in racial equity? And how did the county's employees of color assess us in each of the core competencies? And I want to notice, are there any significant differences on how white employees assessed us for the county and how employees of color assessed us in each competency for the county? And this is where you can be able to get to see some of those differences and as well as similarities. And if you look at the bottom, there's a color legend here. Anywhere you see statements that are outlined in green, that means that white employees as well as employees of color assessed the county in very similar ways. Where you see statements that are outlined in red, you begin to see the race scores. That means that white employees and employees of color had statistically significant differences in how they assessed us in those competencies. And I'm going to pass it over to Renee to give us some more insight into this very important slide.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a very important slide as we work in attitude behavior change, and we look at not just how well are we being rated on a competency, but how similar are our groups really performing or reporting to each other. And so this really helps us to identify where maybe we need to be working, not just on improving our scores, but really actually making sure everyone understands the same thing in our organization. So the larger that value on this slide is how large they are apart as a group. And so we flag in red some of those largest values so you can focus on some of those areas to help bring consensus. Because again, we can move forward both in just improving scores, but really also in making sure that we have consensus among our different groups. Kenosha County had 4 out of the 6 competency groups were all green, meaning that regardless of whether they had low to high commitment, were very strong in their agreement, or they really had good consensus. But the 2 areas where consensus was starting to show difference is really in leadership commitment and capacity building commitment. So those are going to be areas where we want to focus on some of our sort of bridging the gap between those groups. Thanks, Bert.
Okay, great. Thank you, Renee. And again, this slide will give you just a different perspective as far as an illustration here in a chart view to kind of let you see how did white employees for the county and employees of color for the county assess us in each of the 6 core competencies. The dark blue line here represents our white employees and how they assessed us. And the lighter blue line right underneath represents how our employees of color assessed us in each of the 6 core competencies. And if you could just kind of take a step back and look at this, you will see in every single core competency, employees of color assessed the county lower, except for knowledge and competence commitment, where they rated slightly higher. And then you can also see highlighted here, anywhere you see the stars, these are what we call significant differences, statistically significant differences. And again, now this allows us to understand how our priorities might change. Remember, I showed you a slide like this earlier, and it only looked at the aggregate view. Remember, the aggregate can just dump all groups in together, and whichever group may be more dominant based on numbers could skew the results. But if you look at race consensus, which is what you want to do in a racial equity audit assessment, you want to factor in those smaller groups, what primarily are employees of color, to see how factor in their responses as well, as far as giving them some weight in this discussion on how are we doing overall in advancing racial equity. And that's what race consensus does in these areas. And you notice they can shift our priorities now based on the race consensus different. Before, our highest priorities were capacity building and data and disparities. And our lowest priority was belonging and inclusion commitment. But when you factor in the race consensus and the differences, then your priorities can change, which could have been a blind spot had you not factored in race consensus in that area. Not just looking at race and ethnicity, what about manager and staff consensus on racial equity? And so now we're taking the same concept, but now we want to know, how did managers rate us or assess the county on racial equity, and how did staff assess us on racial equity as well? And as you can see, the top dark blue line represents management, and the lighter blue line represents how staff assessed us in these areas as well. And you notice that you'll see some larger differences on belonging and inclusion. Management rated us very, very high, highly in the committed section, where staff rated us a little bit lower. And that's a pretty significant, so it's our largest significant difference here on belonging and inclusion. After that, we've got leadership commitment, probably some manager bias there, that managers think they're really showing commitment to advancing racial equity, but staff are saying that we've still got some work to do. And so you can see, and then we've got capacity building as well. After those three, you've got smaller differences in some of the other areas. Now this brings us to a similar slide as earlier, but now we want to look at what is our actual level of racial equity commitment. And the key word is actual, because now this slide factors in race consensus. Prior, our score was 3.66. That was the aggregate score. But when you factor in race consensus, our actual score on this racial equity continuum moves us down to 3.54 for year one. Now, for organizations and institutions just beginning their racial equity work, we tend to see institutions and organizations fall between 2 and 3 when they begin to start this work. And so this is a baseline year for where does the county need to go now from here? And that's what we want to be thinking about. It's not about, is this good or bad? It's about, you know what, this we've got the data. We want to be very data driven now, and we want to use facts. I always say focus on facts, not feelings, and use this data to be able to leverage all of the talent and the knowledge that we have within the county at all different levels to advance and move forward. Now we will shift into our next phase of our report roadmap, which is looking at the road to commitment. So we've got the data. We know how we were assessed in these core competencies. We kind of know what our employee sample looks like who responded to this data. Now, what do we do with it? And with that, I'm going to transition it back over to Renee to think about what are some immediate actions we can begin to take to move forward.
Thanks, Bert. So we've prepared for you a roadmap that you can utilize for each of the 6 areas of commitment. And so you can see here this road to institutional commitment. We always like to use this sort of windy road. As Bert will tell you, like, it's never really stairs that you climb that are very even leveled. This is a process and a path, and it winds and twists and requires kind of that journey. It's never really sort of just a straight line, but you know, these competencies allow us to transition into action statements of things that we can complete or work on or do as an organization or a county to then work towards strong commitment. And so we've actually color-coded based on the scores of the assessment, three different levels of where you fall on these action items. You can see in these functional competencies, green checks means these are developed. You were rated above a 3.75. There's an appendix slide that showcases a bit more information about this breakdown legend, but also that you have really good consensus between your racial groups. So both groups score above a 3.75, but also that you have both groups in agreement on these competencies. And these are things we don't want to lose sight of. We want to make sure that we maintain, that we don't suddenly focus too much on other areas and then our green areas fall. So these are things where we are doing well, we're developed, but we want to maintain those. Yellows are things that the functional competency is started. So there are scores greater than a 3, but maybe there is still room to grow on these competencies. And then gray indicates things that we classify as not currently in practice, meaning that their score is below that value, or the discrepancy between, or the difference between the racial groups was very strong. And so there needs to be work done there. Again, these are not the only paths that you can take. These are a starting point for you. We want to kind of leave you with, where can we go? What are some of the things we can work on now? But you may have other ideas that address some of these priority areas. And so we want you to utilize this as an idea, but to build on it, that what works for your county.
Yeah, thank you, Renee. And I think that's really important to reemphasize that, is that we're not saying to the county, you just need to look at each one of these roads, because as Renee said, each one of the core competencies has their own unique road to commitment. So we're not saying the county should just go through and just try to get green check marks on all of these and just kind of do a check the box task list. It's really about getting people on board, getting their buy-in. I'm a strong believer that people tend not to destroy that which they help to create. So it's getting ideas from all different levels, management, staff, and really advancing on this journey together. That's how, you don't want compliance, where you want commitment. Compliance is just, let's just check the box and say we did it and get it over with. Whereas committed, we truly understand why it's important, mission, vision, and values, and we work together to create it, and it becomes a habit. It becomes standard operating procedure versus just checking the boxes. And as you can see here, this is another example of, we've got an area that's been developed. We want to maintain that. We've got some other areas that are not as developed as well. And so each one of these, now you're looking at capacity building. You notice we don't have any green check marks here or any yellow check marks. So this is a great opportunity for capacity building to really get stronger in this area. And then we also have data and disparities. You notice also that we've got some work to do in this areas as well. Again, I look at these as opportunities. I don't look at it as like, oh, we're deficient in those areas. We have the opportunities to really go. We're a county who's just had the courage to start this journey on advancing racial equity. And that's really important to really emphasize. And then we have belonging and inclusion. Wow, look at that. We finally got some green checks that are popping up. That's a good thing, right? So that's good. That's saying that we're doing some things right, and our employees recognize that we're doing some things right as it relates to the best practices of racial equity. So we've got some green check marks there that shows that we've developed those competencies based on how we've scored. And then we've got some areas that are kind of in progress, but we can strengthen a little bit more. Okay. And then finally, our knowledge and competence as well. Again, we've got some few competencies that have been developed, and then we've got some opportunities to grow. And so again, just to re-summarize these roadmaps, these are more of just wanting that we don't want to leave the county just stuck with, hey, we gave you the score, we gave you the data, now what do you do? This is something that we can recommend based on the data that we've seen on how to improve these areas, but we also welcome just being leaders and taking ownership and then also developing your own ideas as well, but at least giving you a little bit of a framework, something to be able to digest and begin to think about as you continue this journey. This now will move us into our next phase, which are the recommendations and next steps. And keep in mind, this is a narrative phrase. So I'll allow you all to kind of read this in your spare time when you have a chance to digest this a little bit more. I know we're throwing a lot of terminology at you, a lot of concepts, so I won't read this word for word. But just to summarize this, it just talks about how we understand the county is just beginning this work. We don't expect the county to have very, very strong scores if they're just beginning this work. But obviously, you all have done some things, whether it's related to training or communication, that has allowed the employees to respond in a positive way in some areas, and then recognizing that we've got some areas to really focus on. Our strongest indicator of commitment was our knowledge and competence. Our employees are really telling us that they understand why racial equity was important. And so now I think we have to really begin to equip our management, our leadership. We need to equip them with tools and ideas for how to take this data and advance it forward. And I know that Clara's got some ideas around training as well. And I really think that we don't want to set our management, our leadership, our staff up for failure. Now that we've got this data, we can make very targeted efforts to really begin to make progress and track our progress along this. We don't just want to say, okay, everybody just go to implicit bias training. It's more about that. It's about understanding, how do you look at a policy or practice and see if it impedes equity or if it contributes to equity. And I think it's training on policies and practices as well. Remember that I said that can often be unintentionally producing and sustaining inequities, whether it's by race or gender. And so I think it's just doing that. We don't want to just do the normal, just send someone to bias training, diversity training, and then come back. We know from research that doesn't work. Training is a supplemental tool to policies and practices as well. This next slide. What does the pathway to becoming a committed institution look like? This is also a very important slide. So if we were to kind of say, you know what, if the county really wanted to focus on maybe what's one of the most effective ways to becoming a committed institution over time, remember, this doesn't happen overnight. Renee and her research team, they do different scenario analysis and to begin looking at, if we were to improve in these competencies over a certain period of time, what could our score begin to look like over time? And so I call these the Great 8, because there's 8 competencies that can advance overall commitment, but you can also achieve, remember, we want to have that race consensus, where we don't want to have large differences between white employees and our employees of color. Now, it doesn't mean we want zero difference. We just want that difference down to a point where it's not statistically significant, okay? And that's really important. So the research team has done some situation and scenario analysis where if we were to focus on these grade 8, we could see the county go from 3.54 to 3.94 over time, which would put the county on the continuum scale of being a committed institution. And so that's what we also wanted to provide. We thought that would be a great value add as far as, we're not saying you have to do these grade 8. We just wanted to show you what it could possibly look like. This also depends on resources. It depends on management staff, who's in place and position. You may not be able to do all of these. You may only do a handful, but it really depends on having a deeper leadership discussion on where the county wants to begin to focus. But we wanted to at least give you some type of scenario to be able to look and see what it could look like. Renee, anything else to add on this?
No,
just wanted
exactly.
to make sure. I didn't miss anything? Okay. All right. Now we move into our last phase, which is the appendix. And the appendix is for all of you that are those detail-oriented, want to look in the granular details of the audit assessment, all the data. We have that available for you as well. This right here, this slide just gives you a deeper definition of those 4 types of institutions. Remember, we said what's a colorblind, what's a cautious, what's a compliant, and what's a committed institution. It just kind of gives you some more ways to identify them. There were also some questions that were in the audit assessment that were not included in our scoring methodology, but that we wanted to at least capture to see if we could get some insights from that. And so now I'll transition this back over to Renee to kind of share with us some of those insights.
Thanks, Bert. I know we are pushing up on our hard stop of 7:30, and we want to leave a few minutes for questions. So I'll just briefly talk about, these questions are sort of how our different groups, our organization as a whole, and the different race groups maybe have reported in work and their professional network, which we expect differences there. These are tough conversations to have in the workplace. Also looking at, the racial makeup of my employees within my division reflects the diversity of our community. So things like that. And so I feel comfortable bringing forward any issues or concerns I have regarding racial equity to leadership. And so again, like the charts before, but really in numeric format, this highlights with a red star where there are differences between the racial groups and the white group, and where you may want to be focusing on how do we close that gap on things like feeling comfortable or reflecting diversity. And again, these are questions around interest in affinity groups. So Kenosha County was interested in asking, were employees interested in participating in affinity groups? And so we can see 11% were interested in affinity groups, and that was predominantly made up of people of color, but there were some white individuals as well. And then Bert, if you want to go to the next slide, we can look at, this tells you kind of what affinity groups they were interested in. So you can see that there was the persons of color, a large affinity group interest in the Black affinity group, Latinx, also with the white group interested in LGBTQ. So this will help you maybe think about, if we're going to invest in affinity groups, how do we, where do we start those?
Great. Thank you, Renee.
Thank you.
And the next several slides, again, we won't cover all those. We want to make time for questions, but they just talk about how did we assess it? How did we score our audit assessment as well? And then it gives you all of the detailed data and tables related to the individual answers based on whites and people of employees of color, as well as even a more disaggregated breakdown between white, Black, Hispanics, and other groups. And then last but not least, we will also see some select departments as well as manager and staff, but we will also see some select departments who have data based on them as well. We know we have the Sheriff's Department, Health and Human Services. You can see detailed individual data on this department, as well as Brookside, Willowbrook, and the courthouse. And so with that, and as well as Public Works, I think we have Public Works in there as well. Okay. And so with that, I want to transition it back over to Clara, because I do want to just make sure we have enough time to get some questions in if we need those.
Thank you, Bird. Thank you, Renee. Questions?
Dave Selberg, did you have your name up? Zach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through the chair to these folks, or maybe even Clara, how do we promote participation in this survey? Because we've got nearly 2/3, if I remember correctly, of our staff that didn't take this survey.
So participation rates are not uncommon, this kind of numbers. And so when we talk about these numbers, but to increase the rates is, I think Bert will have some thoughts on, making this, really important by department. So having managers and staff really know that the assessment is coming, not just an email maybe from HR, but from other leadership can help to incorporate getting that assessment. I think usually baseline, you start to see people, maybe they don't quite know what this is it really anonymous? And then the voice kind of continues and carries after round one. So we often see participation rates go up after the first year, and look at those as well.
And do you,
thank you, Renee.
I was going to ask, do you guys often see organizations mandate this survey from their employees?
We don't usually see requirement to take it, but usually what they'll do in that case is do an opt-out when they sign on. So they always will give an opportunity, so they may at least have to take it, but usually that implies that you are tracking, and respondents don't, you know, this is a sensitive topic, and respondents, when they feel tracked, feel like management may call them out on a specific data point, even if they are not tracked. And so that's where you have to kind of ride that line of, you know, we want to get good data, but we don't want to scare people from participating.
Okay, thank you.
Supervisor Gully?
You guys hear me? Is that on? Yeah. I guess either to the consultants or direct to TAPA. So the functional competencies are based on the responses, right? I would imagine you take like the scoring, and then as long as there's not a huge difference between groups, you assign whether it's developed or started or not currently. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a whole slide in the appendix that kind of outlines the developed versus started versus not developed yet competencies.
So is there also an internal check then against that? Because the perception around where we were or where we are could be different than like actual reality of policy. So is there also then an internal review to look at it and go, well, people think we're not doing this, but we actually are, or people
I'm
don't
sure
think we're doing this?
Yeah, Bird probably has the next steps around that. Usually what we see in organizations when we see the leadership go, oh, we are doing this, but the staff don't necessarily report that. Usually that's following then needing a communication plan around that particular strategy or component or policy. So usually that's kind of the things that I'll see in organizational change, where we just need to have some targeted communication plans built. Bird?
Yeah, that's great. You know, one example I'll give to that is that, you know, many times an organization will have a diversity, equity, and inclusion officer. Now, that position may be present, but not necessarily effective, right? Because they're not given the authority or the resources to really create transformational change that's needed to accomplish that. So many times, just because things are present, employees are like, yeah, they're there, but they're not really there. They're not really effective in a lot of different ways. So we're saying one thing, but we're kind of doing another. And so it's really important, like Renee was saying, that this is really made a priority. Employees really usually pay attention to what management is paying attention to. What do they talk about in meetings? How do they develop their goals? And if all of those things are integrated, then it becomes a habit and it becomes a priority for everyone.
Thank you. And then to Director Tappa, I had to notice that on the cover slide, this is dated in September of 21. When did staff receive this?
Receive the report or the survey?
The report.
We rolled out to staff last week. We had a couple of sessions. We started with division department heads and our diversity task force, and then we did some employee sessions. It's actually out on our intranet so that employees can take a look at it whenever they like.
Because a lot of this would have been really beneficial to have when we were talking about the D&I position and the budget. I mean, a lot of the data that we said, wow, if we only knew that is in here.
Oh.
Okay.
Supervisor Uhas?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Supervisor Gully, that was a couple of my questions as well. Why this is dated in September and we're just getting it now at, you know, mid-November, because there's a lot of good information in here that would have been enlightening for many people. And I think there would have been a lot less angst at that meeting if we would have had this information. Information is power and it needs to be shared. On that note, Reggie, I'd like to thank you because at 6:58 a.m. I emailed you this morning asking for a copy of this report to be disseminated to all the supervisors. And by 9:18, you had it out there to everyone. So I really appreciate you going above and beyond because I know you didn't have this available. So thank you so much for getting this out to everyone so we had time to review it. And that's all I have. So thank you, Reggie.
You're welcome, but I'd like to say it was Clara's quick response, and I probably could have got it out a little bit sooner, but I was a little tied up with something else. But thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing none. Thank you for the concise report.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
I think
Thank you
if anybody
for having-
has any further questions going forward, I think that you might want to direct them to Claire Tappa in Human Services. You might come up with some things later on. And would that be okay, Claire? Thank you.
Absolutely.
Motion to adjourn. Moved and seconded. All those in favor? Aye. Any nays? Thank you.